Bonjour, bonsoir à toutes et à tous.
Hello, everyone. We are most happy to be with you. I'm Jérôme CHAPUIS, director of in La Croix. I'm very happy to be here for the session number 31 on taxation, a democratic issue. Talking about democracy is really at the very core of the topic, because we could have endless discussions about the use of taxes and their impact, but if we do not have the approval of citizens and the elements about the finality, the social and ethical goals of this, it would be no end. So we have with us Béatrice DESHAYES, tax director at LVMH, Bernard SANANES at ELAB, we have Edna JAIME, who is Mexican. She's been in public life for 25 years, and she's at Evalua, a group that assesses public policies. And remotely, we have Michel CICUREL, who has been active in talking about fiscality and public policies in Europe. And hello, Bertrand BADRE. You are a member of the Service Économiques, and you will therefore introduce the topic. Thank you very much. It is indeed a challenge to mobilize people to talk about fiscality and taxation in Aix at 5:30 when it's 34 degrees. But I can tell you that the people who prefer to go to a spa or to the swimming pool or to eat an ice cream will be missing something. More than the word taxation, the important word is a democratic issue. What can our democracies take, especially at tax level? Obviously, it's a multifaceted topic. In a way, we are all taxpayers, so we all have our opinion on taxes. We are all citizens. We all have our opinions on democracies. We're all the guarantors of loans that have cost a lot to the country, even though we hope to pass it on to our successors. So obviously, we'll only cover but a few topics about this. Let me give you a few ideas to initiate the discussion. To be somewhat prospective, because the umbrella topic of these REA are to succeed in transforming the world. So there are the elements of global taxation. Can you tax multinational companies? I believe my neighbor will say a word about this. There's the issue of national discussions. We'll see that there are fiscal topics. Should we change VAT, the taxation of oil products? And then we all have in mind the topic of yellow vests or yellow jackets. So after 6 months of political campaign, we hardly covered these topics, even though we know that taxation is the basis of representative democracy, as it is based on taxation. So the issue is to see if taxation, which is a highly democratical topic, only became a technical topic from experts. And there's the other issue in Florida. The governor of Florida sanctioned very strongly the Disney Group for disputing an educational policy of the state. The governor said, well, okay, you will lose your advantages, your tax incentives. Let me finish with two things. I love investing in sustainable development in emerging countries. In 2015, for sustainable development, we had a roadmap for the planet with the Paris Agreement on climate. We made an enthusiastic choice of an inclusive economy, which would be both resilient and sustainable. Can we head in that direction without revisiting our tax systems? And I'm not just talking about the carbon tax. Above and beyond carbon tax, should we review and revisit our tax systems to make them resilient and sustainable as well. So this is an issue of understanding and deliberation. Second thing, the fiscality of emerging countries. There again, I'm happy that we have Laura with us today. We decided to change our planet to make it sustainable, but it's not an issue of development or money transfer from migrants. It's not only an issue of investment in the countries, it's an issue of local taxation. The reality is that this transition will be funded by taxes in these countries, but in most of these countries, taxation is low with a rate of 10 to 20% as much. Very little VAT, very little taxes. And as we had a leapfrog in the field of telecoms, can we hope for a fiscal or taxation leapfrog jumping directly to a better system? So I'll stop at that. I hope that some major changes in economics are necessary but difficult, and one of them is that of taxation, and there's a lot to be discussed today. We're in a connected manner with our democracy, which is quite fragile. Well, right away, let me give you the floor, Bernard SANANES. You know the way, a few minutes for each, and then we'll take questions from the public. What strikes you, Bernard SANANES? What are you stricken by when you look at this in France? So, over the past 10 years, three elements have really been striking. In 2013, the Minister of Economy and Finance himself talked about people being a tax overflow, really, people being fed up with taxation. And then people remember that he was asked, what do you do with the money? And also there's the famous whatever the cost during the COVID crisis, and so taxation no longer seems to be one of the top concerns, far behind the purchasing power. In fact, not enough. And even in the issue of purchasing power, we don't consider that the tax issue is so important. Obviously, there is this link with citizenship and democracy and this consent agreement to pay the taxes. First of all, are taxes still seen as a citizens' act? Well, recently I've sort of taken a poll, and the result is divided 52-48. In what way? 52 for no and 48 for yes. So we do see that this is a system that is quite divided, and on this issue to know whether it's a citizen's action, there's the issue of do I contribute more than I get from the system? Well, people feel that they give more to the system than they get back. Second question, fair policy. Second question that was asked, no surprise, for 70% of the French people, the tax system is not fair. And there's not so much difference between the richer and the poorer. It's interesting to note, even though an obvious majority of French people feel that to fund pensions and the economy, you should tax more the wealthier, and this is understandable. And next point about fairness. This fairness is a topic the minister knows well, even if he discovers the topic, the taxing of GAFAMs. 80% of the French people feel it would be fair to tax the GAFAMs. So we observe that consent to pay taxes is clearly more favorable in regions that are so-called doing well. If you compare Brittany, Pays de Loire, and Île-de-France that are doing well, and if you compare them to Bourgogne-Franche-Comté or Hauts-de-France or Val-de-Loire, there's 10% difference in their consent to pay taxes. People will say, well, why should I pay the same taxes if my children have to travel 15 kilometers to go to school every day when my cousin's child only has 2 metro stops to go to school? It's unfair. And third topic is, are taxes well used? No, for 70% of the French people. And this is an issue of how the taxes should be used. The question is, if you were to pay more taxes, why would you use the taxes? First issue is health, then police, and there's quite a few elements in that. Let me present three things. First of all, taxes are badly communicated when in your daily life, when you go to the police, when you go to a hospital, they never remind you the taxes that have been paid for that. The second thing, when you pay, when you have to fill in your tax returns, you maybe there should be a possibility to say, well, this is what I would like my taxes to do, to enable me to do. And then the third possibility, we talk a lot about referendum. It would be a good thing every year if people, when they filled in their tax returns, could say whether they're satisfied with the way their taxes were used. Thank you, Bernard. Béatrice DESHAYES, let me give you the floor because very often LVMH is considered as the top taxpayer in France. So, do you have a viewpoint about that and about the multinational or international stakes there? You're right. We're the first top taxpayer in France, but I'm not here to market the fiscal policy of LVMH. But to return to what Mr. SANANES was just saying, there's interesting things in this. The reaction of citizens to paying taxes, their consent, and the fair taxing of GAFAMs. For a while, I've been questioning the public. I won't do it today, but when I ask the question in a conference to ask people whether they are happy to pay taxes or they feel they pay too much taxes, most of them tell me that personally they feel they pay too much taxes. And it's quite often the case, at least. And the second question I ask them usually is, do they consider that large corporations, not small companies, but large corporations pay enough taxes or not enough? And most of them, even when I have corporate leaders in the company, in the audience, they mostly say no. The large corporations don't pay enough taxes. So let me try to react to this and shed as much light as possible. Well, on this issue of taxes and a democratic issue, we're faced with a paradox. At democratic level, the companies that can mention a tax citizenship have no voting right. So it's a paradox, really. And secondly, how can we find a fair answer and a fair redistribution for companies that develop at international level? Because most of major groups in France and international groups have activities throughout the world. As far as the position we have in the democratic debate is, I feel that we must show that we are taxpayers, and earlier we talked about a carbon tax, which was a failure in France, and some companies took this into their hands and decided that they were going to impose on themselves a carbon tax, and this is what LVMH has done. So, second topic, which may sound more technical, but it's important because I'm a technician and I might shed some light for you. This topic of international taxation and how can we find a fair redistribution of the taxes. For about 10 years, for a decade, our countries, especially with the arrival of the GAFAs in the economy, our countries were faced with a difficult issue to know if our tax systems were still efficient to tax companies whose physical footprint in the countries where they were present may have been very small. This is when two major projects of international tax reform appeared, and they're still being discussed. The first one is how can we redistribute better the tax basis between the countries, anchoring it on the consumption country. And secondly, can we find a minimum tax because these companies don't pay enough taxes, and if we could increase it by 10 or 15%, we could find an answer to all that. It's true enough that the international system is probably finished because it's very much attached to a system with a physical base, with warehouses, stores, etc., physical people, and this is something that does not correspond to the GAFAs. OECD introduced the famous pillar number one, which is about redistributing more fiscal base in the distribution countries, the market, for like France for the GAFAs, or to impose a minimum 15% tax, whatever the operations. This was announced at great noise more than a year ago, and to be honest, nothing has been applied. And in the meantime, the companies have to face the countries, for example, LVMH, when we sell in China and we have consumers in China, maybe the pillar number one is not active, but how can we sort of act as this tax is not active yet? Very often the announcements by the governments or their representatives are a bit too fast, because you have to respond to the questioning and the demands of citizens when they say, where do you stand for GAFAs? And so it's difficult to answer, and we have to adapt in the meantime to satisfy the expectations of all. So please make headway quickly, because it's urgent now. Jean-Noël BARROT can answer you. I was hearing him say that things are progressing, and we'll also give the floor to Edna JAIME. But before I give the floor to her, we have a visio conference with Michel CICUREL. Hello. We heard that our tax systems have to be revisited. They're obsolete. Do you agree?
I think it's worse than that. I think that taxation is a necessary evil, but intrinsically a bad tool. And I would like to explain that. I'm talking about all obligatory taxation. Bertrand BADRE was saying between consentment to taxation and that has a political origin that's as opposed to monetary policy, because that guarantees political independency. They were able to brilliantly globalize, while taxation is incapable of transforming the changing of the world. All of the perversions can be linked to this. The sound is not great. Apparently you can't hear us. I'll see if our technicians can do anything. Please continue. You were saying that taxation suffered from extreme politicization? And I said especially in France, because French taxation, and I'm using strong terms, it can trick people because it looks for an announcement effect rather than a real effect. taxes that are the most in the media, the most discussed by politicians, are often just minor, like the tax on fortune, or they're secondary, like income tax, that bring in less than 2/3 that what the CSG does and half of what VAT does. So to take the example of the patriotic prison in national habits, there are rights acquired on tobacco, alcohol, and wine. On tobacco, it's 65% alcohol, 30%, and wine, only 1%. And Père Mendes France must be turning over in his grave now for 40 years when he sees. So taxation is political. It's not visionary. It's the feet are stuck in the clay. And climate experts say that the carbon tax is the best tool to decarbonate, but it'll never be applied globally, so it won't exist. The principle of an adjustment mechanism that was adopted by the EU at the last day of the French presidency is an excellent thing, and it addresses some European imports with high carbon levels, steel, cement, etc. It's $500 million, just a small proportion of global GDP. So there's confiscatory taxation on the capital, as according to Piketty, to light against the growing of people's own personal wealth. It's a brilliant product of exportation that convinces intellectuals, but no governments to adopt it. It's far from a political gesture. We know that taxing investment capital and companies is harmful to employment, and employment will always be the first driver for increasing wages. And as Madame Béatrice said earlier, with the OECD, that we have the highest taxation rates, and we will never believe in globalized taxation, but the British use the same term for fiscal policy, for both fiscal policy and budgetary policy, which is not the case in France. So it's impossible that the major transformations in the world go without an increase in public expenditure. Mr. Lorenzri wanted to reconcile Keynes, this provident state and innovation, and it's very necessary today. Without a contribution of investment and protection, we will not be able to take out the challenges of the climate, given the demographic explosion. The global population, let me remind you, will double from 5 billion to 10 billion in 50 years. So we're discovering pandemics. There's the fragmentation of the world, the war in Ukraine. We have to mobilize private savings. I think private savings with a guarantee of the state, but public power must share expenditures and the risks of these transformations. But supporting and working with the big transformations can have to face another transformation in Western society. That's the shift in the middle classes. They're threatened by emerging work, artificial intelligence, and the middle class, too rich to get any support and too poor to support the taxes that finance the assistance, feel that they're being abandoned. As Bertrand SANANES said earlier, I contribute more than I receive, and the middle classes really believe this, and getting the rich to pay is politically impossible. It's been asked for forever, but we always tax the middle class. We never tax the rich. So the fiscal policy in developed worlds, regardless of their structure, always arrive at similar results. They're just slightly redistributive. So France does not escape the rule, and it's because it has the biggest record as a providence, as a welfare state. You have to conclude, please. I'll conclude by saying that I think we're going to have to use debt, virtuous debt, that fosters growth, employment, and competitiveness. And to conclude, I wanted to say in a word that we'll have to listen to the comedian Alphonse Allais. We have to ask more from taxes and less from the people who pay taxes. Thank you. Mr. CICUREL, you'll come back when we take questions. You would like to talk about the participation of citizens in the elaboration of taxation. And in Mexico, Mrs. Jaime, do your compatriots consider taxation the same way as we do, as Marcel Adenes said about France?
We have a much problematic budget taxation and budgetary policy. Thank you very much. I feel very privileged to be here, and I'm going to talk about Mexico perspective. And I will do that because I think it reflects a very essential problem that is not only Mexican. As probably you know, Mexico is firmly established as an upper-middle income nation. It's part of the G20 and also the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. At the same time, Mexico has tremendous challenges and limitations in terms of taxations, which are the reflection of a weak economy governance and even a weaker rule of law. What we have today in Mexico can be summarized as bad taxation and worse representation. If taxation is the expression of a social pact, then it is clear that Mexico urgently needs a new social pact. We have bad taxation and worse representation not because we pay too much taxes, but because we pay too little. The average OECD country has a tax to GDP ratio of 33.5%. In Mexico, ratio is 17.9. However, the state in Mexico is not technically broken. After massive economic crisis in the 80s, it learned to live by its own means. Since then, fiscal discipline has been maintained, but that has provoked that the state in Mexico is rather poor. A government living with its means that are not handful has translated into a chronic underinvestment in infrastructure, public security, education, health. This in turn has contributed to lock Mexico into a low growth, low productivity trap. Public expenditure in Mexico also lacks quality and lacks accountability. This is a very important point. For instance, in 2013, a tax reform increased revenue. We have tax reforms. And to its credit, the current administration has made great efforts to ensure that big taxpayers pay their share. But despite increases in revenue, Mexico has chronically underinvested in physical and human capital. Government has more money, but it's not well assigned. In Mexico Evalúa, the think tank I lead, we have made a sustained effort to understand what we call the black box of public expenditure. We have found that the governance of budgeting fails to ensure proper oversight on all its phases. The federal government, the government, has enormous discretionary power, the executive power, to change the budget as it seems to fit, while Congress is secondary actor which fails to perform its role of oversight. The government spends the amounts it doesn't spend, the amounts it got approved. It spends in a discretionary matter, it spends either more or it spends in different ways. So as I have to conclude, so as you can see, there's no way of a nexus, of a link between budgeting, taxation, and effective representation. We have promoted a proposal of a fiscal council, a very technical instance in the congressional branch, in order to make sound analysis and to provide to lawmakers with information that can put the same level of ground to the executive and congressional branch. If I have more time, I will return to this point. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup et on pourra effectivement revenir sur ce point. Jean-Noël BARROT, beaucoup de...
Thank you very much. Jean-Noël BARROT, many questions. We would like to tell you about the digital issues, but maybe I saw you reacting earlier on to what Béatrice DESHAYES was saying about intentions of OECD. You were saying things are progressing. On a better way of taxing companies at a time when the national location is a complication. Yes, thank you very much. I believe that, as Bertrand BADRE was saying, the topic of the panel is really the right one. Is taxation a democratic challenge? Yes, it is. And suffice it to look at French history with the long series of tax revolutions to see that. At the time of Richelieu, when Richelieu tried to centralize in Paris the collection of taxes, the people from Aix just started wearing bells to create a demonstration and protest. In the end, this turned back on them, but the taxes and the demonstration was stopped, but the taxes were not re-centralized. So taxes, we all agree, are a must. But we must have a taxation system which has a number of specificities, and I'd like to mention three, which are not always convergent. It must be measured or controlled, efficient and fair. Average or controlled, it's a relative word. But for a long time in France, we were under the feeling that tax pressures were higher than what it was in other OECD countries, which led the previous government to have a very ambitious speech and very stable one on the issue of taxation, because contrary to the two previous mandates where taxes were increased, then reduced, then increased and reduced again. During the first 5-year tenure of Emmanuel Macron, the taxes were clearly reduced despite the crisis, and we managed to get out of the first position on the podium of countries where we have the highest tax pressure in OECD. So this perception, which is the one we have not only in France but in other countries about the level of taxes in France, and I believe that this feeling of being fed up at tax levels is something that people used to have and maybe don't so much have now. So taxation that has to be controlled and that must be considered as fair. People say when economists say when you tax an object or something, if it's an elastic base, you run the risk of this basis being reduced, and then in the end you will no longer have anything to tax. The big mistake of our leaders for decades was not to listen to economists, and in particular in France, to consider that the industry or companies were something that would never leave France, and that you could organize your taxing around them, and that was rather heavy and probably led to the loss of 2 million industrial jobs over the 3 or 4 last decades. And nowadays, as we have seen that the tax differences were too important with other countries, this has led to a reduction in production taxes with the economic recovery plan in order to give some breathing time for French companies. Now they are coming back to France. Last year, in 2021, there were twice as many plants opening in France than plants closing. So we have a lot to catch up, but we're on the right track. So an efficient taxation is a taxation that takes into account the fact that when you have a fiscal base, if you tax it too much, it erodes, and in the end, you have nothing to tax anymore. And then the last thing is that it must be fair and seen as fair. And if you talk about corporate taxes, Béatrice was right in saying that people that consider that not only GAFAMs but big international corporations are not sufficiently taxed. And this is the result of the major evolutions in our world with the globalization of exchanges, the fragmentation of production lines. You have a value chain which is made up in all corners of the planet. Where do you tax them? And then you have the digital elements where products are sometimes produced very far from where they are consumed. So this led to a feeling of unfairness from citizens, small and medium-sized companies who pay the full Monty, so to say. And they are upset to see that next to them they have big companies that manage to divide their production or separate the production place of the digital services, and they managed to escape taxes, which is why OECD started this huge work, which was mentioned earlier, with an agreement of 136 countries around corporate taxes. This is Pillar 2, and the place where they're taxed, Pillar 1. And this is why the French presidency of the EU put this topic at the very top of its agenda. So we didn't reach an agreement fully. You may have followed the topic. Poland and then Hungary tried to push their advantage. They were not opposed in principle to the minimum taxes on these companies, but they did realize that they were the last countries to have to give their agreement. And so they tried to obtain a few things from their European partners to get to the global agreement. But I'm rather optimistic, and Bruno Le Maire will probably confirm that tomorrow. We'll end up with this major historical headway in tax level, meaning we will compensate for this major unfairness which was leading to people failing to consent to pay taxes. Okay, to answer the question, taxation a democratic issue, in France we have a government that drafts the financial law and the parliament votes for it. As you know, you know that the parliament is going to have more power now because the majorities are more reduced. So we'll have a most interesting democratic debate this fall, and they'll have to decide on the taxes that are levied. So let's meet in the fall.
Thank you, Jean-Noël BARROT. A few questions and some comments from all of you, if you'd like to take the floor on the points that were raised during the discussion, then we'll take a few questions from the room. I think there's a node that we didn't really talk about, taxation as a democratic issue? Does this question make sense when in the context of globalization? But there's fiscal tax competition between the great blocs, but also from the French side within the European Union. So Jean-Noël BARROT, perhaps you'd like to answer, and Michel CICUREL might have an opinion also. When we're talking about taxation as a democratic issue, are we forgetting that countries are competing against each other to attract money? Yes, you're right. In truth, in a certain number of countries, the government were like the rabbits caught in the headlight. We had big global companies that make decisions to locate their offices based on the tax environment in the country, and so the only possible reaction is to drop the company taxes to bring in as many companies as possible. What is new, and that's the reason for which this agreement that was found at the OECD that will soon be passed into law is major, because the countries of the OECD, European countries, have decided to work together to end this taxation competition that was hurting them in the end. It brought their tax revenue down and reduced their ability to finance their fiscal model and their public services, and this is important. The countries, by joining cartels, if you like, in quotation marks, allow them to find a solution. The Western countries, European countries, in this race to stop the lowest taxation rates, which was harming everybody. I don't want to provoke you, but I'd also like to talk about the reality of this question. Recently, I was talking with someone at Bercy, who's in charge of artificial intelligence for tax audits. So they set up systems to predict and identify tax anomalies so that they can identify what will happen. This is at the French Ministry of Finance. Is there a similar program at a European level? Because it would be even better to do it together. And he said, no. Our challenge is to protect France. And the reality and the paradox that we're confronted with is that taxation is a question of sovereignty, absolute sovereignty. It's the only way that you can have secure resources. And today, like we are always, we're having to deal with the fact that it's difficult to agree when you have to share the money and you don't agree on how to share the money. And that's the real question. So as companies, we're in the middle of this, and the citizens also. We see these wars setting up, but the taxation war between countries is a real thing in OECD countries that were reinforced by the G7, et cetera. But the reality is that the Americans don't really want this reform because their industry will be impacted. The French don't want their companies, our company, to pay more tax in the U.S. and in China. When I talk to people from Bercy, they say, we get money in from the GAFA, but LVMH, you're going to continue to pay your tax in France. I said, we don't care, 25% in France, 25% in China. It's the same thing. I'd rather pay in France. We're a French company, and I know where the money's going. But I just wanted to talk about the reality, really, of the situation. Bernard SANANES, to comment on Jérôme's question, in the relationship with globalization, and we've seen how the French opinion has changed about globalization. It's perceived as a negative thing, a threat, not only in the middle classes, but also in the wealthier classes. There's a feeling that taxation is unequal and globalization is disloyal competition. And this is a big challenge for Europe and the perception of Europe, because what we accept or tolerate for the rest of the world, we hope that at a European level, this harmonization will lead to more faithful competition. Would you like to comment?
As was said in the table, taxation, tax structure, tax policies are sustaining status quo. And I think there is a consensus that the status quo is unsustainable. So we need to change, and we need to open our minds to think out of the box, to try to manage this reality, because status quo is unsustainable. Democracies are failing because there's few expectations about democracy, few expectations about public goods. Inequalities are growing, gaps are growing, so I think we need to think out of the box, and of course, have always in mind that taxation is related to representation and to democracy, so it is not an easy quiz to solve.
Je vois quelques mains qui se lèvent, peut-être au deuxième.
I see some hands going up. Very quickly, we just have a few minutes. Samuel, we talked about the fact that taxes went down in the last 5 years, it's true, but we know that with whatever it costs, the French policy, that taxes will go back up. But the reform of international taxation, as proposed by the OECD, is not going to bring that much in terms of the tax base in France. If tomorrow we have to raise more taxes, new taxes, what will they be? And could they be European taxes? Jean-Noël BARROT, you can't count on the current government to raise taxes. Taxes went down, and I'll repeat what I said earlier. In Nicolas Sarkozy's 5 years, they went down before they went up under François Hollande, and then they went down. This absence of predictability, this tax improvisation is one of the reasons that companies mention when they describe or explain why France is running behind economically. In the last 5 years, the president made commitments, very firm commitments, to bring down company taxes and to get rid of our local inhabitants tax, some labor taxes. And all of these promises were held despite the crises we went through, while bringing our public deficit under the 3% of GDP under 2018 in 2018 and 2019. That hadn't happened for 10 years before. So it's possible to bring taxes down while we bring down the public deficit. They're not contradictory, and this is our objective when we're searching for growth, looking to increase labor in our country. So I'm from the Energy Association. When we talk about the carbon tax, we talk about emission taxes. Have we thought about an upstream tax that will penalize petroleum oil companies? The carbon tax today is on emissions, carbon emissions. Could we think about the fact that it would be more operational to be taxing the producers of fossil fuels, the oil companies and coal companies? Maybe this will lead to some reactions or not. Jean-Noël BARROT, you say that it would be more effective. We'd have to talk about this. The tax will be passed on along the value chain in the different markets. So it's something that could be studied. So the consumer has to feel the carbon tax, otherwise it will be it won't hurt anyone. Sometimes we tax the consumer, but it's passed back onto the producers. So there are incidences in taxation that aren't taken into account in the public debate that we need to look at. We've got 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. BARROT, for having talked about the revolution in Aix-en-Provence. When we consider the rates of abstention in the last elections in France for the municipal elections and the presidential election, could we see another revolution of this type in France? So Bernard SANANES, I don't feel that right now things have happened recently that have relaxed the relationship to taxation. I don't think it's going to be one of the drivers. It could be part of the aggregation of reasons for which people are angry. A new tax on ecology. provoked problems with the Yellow Jackets. And I think that people are more angry about reduced purchasing power. So first, the gentleman in the front row. Quickly. We're at the Rencontres Économiques, and I hear questions about raising or bringing taxes down. So we're getting rid of a fiscal policy. It's increasing some taxes but bringing others down. And here I wonder, I question you, has the President of the Republic given up on democracy because his roadmap is to absolutely give up on increasing taxes? Because it's a driver for democracy, as we said. We did it. We considered that social protection shouldn't only be paid by the labor force, so we brought those contributions down, and it was offset by an increase in the tax, the CSG, with a larger base that impacts capital also. So we did it in the past, and we'll look at this in the future. Unfortunately, we have to conclude. We can't take your question, but come after the panel. We have to conclude, and so I leave the floor to Bertrand for this. Thank you all. It's up to me to conclude a debate that was very rich, confirming the interest of the question that we raised, taxation, a democratic issue. Bernard underscored that there was a link between taxation and democracy that's a heavy but yet fragile link that's poorly understood, with impact on society and on the regions. We need to raise awareness about this. How can we strengthen the link? And at a national level, like at the international level, there are points of misunderstanding. I like the idea of an annual referendum to see if we agree or not. We tend to talk about taxation on individuals. Beyond that, there's taxation of companies. As Béatrice said, they're taxpayers without the right to vote. So for companies, there's an international question. In this world of transformation, there's competition, there's a debate that's more or less civil, more or less violent. And taxation is, above all, in a territorial base that is deeply challenged by competition. It plays a role in transformation. It's difficult. We're trapped by some approaches like the French wealth tax. And we're running behind social expectations, and it's difficult to manage given expectations. It's also crucial. The fragility of middle classes is very important in our taxation acceptance. The question of the participation of citizens, thank you, Edna, for bringing this up. It's crucial on this topic like on others. We saw that with our citizens' debate, taxation can't stay a technical topic. People have to be involved and take ownership of this question. It's true in Mexico. It's true for us. Accountability is very important. I was happy to hear Jean-Noël BARROT remind us that we can advance, and we hope that the OECD will come into play. People were skeptical to my left. The question of taxation, correct taxation, as Alphonse Allais said. So we have two tests ahead of us. The first one, as Jean-Noël said, the test of the National Assembly, our parliament. How are they going to debate these questions in a mature, transparent way? And there's another test. We talked about European sovereignty. I don't think we can talk about European sovereignty without taxation, because everyone's going to play in their own home field. This question of taxation is not a technical question, but it does have technical aspects. And the technical aspects can't transform the perception that's at the heart of the topics here. How can we transform globalization? It's our national social pact, our European social pact, our global social pact that's being challenged. We had 382 years after the revolt in Aix-en-Provence, maybe here in Aix-en-Provence, the Cercle des Économies will launch this positive tax revolt. Thank you, Bertrand. Thank you, everyone.